This lecture describes the Cold War, which begins immediately after World War II and is going to run from about 1945 to about 1990-1991. The Cold War is first and foremost a battle between the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, otherwise known as the USSR. Also, it's an ideological battle between democracy and communism, the two major political ideologies that are battling, and then the economic battle of capitalism versus socialism. So to really understand the issues in the Cold War, you have to understand what we kind of assume about the Soviet Union. So we first of all believe that communism is monolithic, that it's this one singular force, one singular idea that we need to kind of destroy. We believe that it's all centrally directed by Moscow out of the Soviet Union and more specifically Russia. It is infinitely expansive, meaning if we don't do anything to stop it, it is going to continue to spread, and we're going to treat it almost like a disease. And communism is also a threat to American trade, and it's a threat to democratic institutions. So that's why it's capitalism, our economic system, versus communism, versus socialism, and democracy versus communism as a political fight as well. We believe that communism is evil morally. Our belief is that most communists are atheists, and therefore they don't know, right from wrong, and we are a country founded on religious principles. We also believe that most countries of Earth will have to pick a side because there's no room for neutrality in a bipolar world. You are either with us or against us. And that is where most of the Cold War is actually going to be fought. It is called the Cold War because we will not fight our direct enemy, the Soviet Union, out of fear of nuclear weapons and world destruction. We will fight mostly what will become known as third world countries to try to convince them that they should follow our ideology. And the Soviet Union will do the same thing. And we also believe why we're going to fight or get involved in other places is that the U.S. is militarily and diplomatically omnipotent, so we can go and if we go to war, we will win. If we get involved in negotiations, we will also win that as well. So kind of immediately after World War II, we start, and even before World War II ends, we start to notice that there's definitely going to be differences of opinion about how the world should be shaped after the Second World War. And Winston Churchill makes the speech in 1946, and he talks about an iron curtain, that every country behind that red line on the map shown is going to be under control of the Soviet Union without their consent, which is obviously not so democratic. So it's showing kind of a clear dividing line in Europe. And the first years of the Cold War are focused in Europe. We're going to divide Germany, which we will get into a little bit later, and that's kind of the ideology, this clear, distinct split between communism in the Soviet Union and the West and democracy. So one of the first battles of the Cold War is not actually a war, at least that we're going to get involved in militarily, but it's this idea that Greece and Turkey are both having problems with the USSR. Greece is in the middle of a civil war, and they are kind of deciding what type of government they want to institute. The Soviet Union wants communism, we want democracy. In Turkey, they're kind of under pressure from the USSR because they want access to a way out of the Black Sea to the Aegean Sea, Mediterranean, and eventually to the Atlantic Ocean for trade. So Harry Truman, the president at the time, talks about how we should kind of support any free people of the world and support any sort of people who are trying to make decisions about democracy on their own. Now, we obviously would like them to choose democracy because we believe it's the government of freedom, but we won't force that necessarily upon them, and this becomes his doctrine. It basically means that anywhere that communism arises, we are going to go there and try to stop it. We're going to do this through multiple different avenues. We will give Greece and Turkey $400 million in aid as kind of a PR campaign to try to make sure that we will be successful. In addition to just giving money through aid, we also expand our defense budget by several $billions a year to make sure that we can invest in new technologies, more nuclear weapons, and also spread our military might around the world. And this really becomes how we get involved in so many more world affairs, trying to stop the spread of communism and help the spread of democracy across the world. In addition to the Truman Doctrine, we also have the Marshall Plan, which is passed by Secretary of State George Marshall, and it's a European recovery program. So we're trying to rebuild Europe after the Second World War to avoid hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos, and it's offered to all European nations. That includes any nation that the Soviet Union controls, and the Soviet Union itself. That way, we will give this money and aid to countries to rebuild them, and also hope that they would choose somebody like the United States to negotiate with and work with and institute democracy, as opposed to the Soviet Union. We're trying to offer it to the Soviet Union, even though they're our biggest enemy at this point, because it's a PR war to make us look good. If they don't accept it, and they don't, we at least offer it to our greatest enemy. And if they do accept it, then we still look like we are trying to help all countries of the world, as at this point in history, the only superpower with nuclear weapons. So the Marshall Plan, Greece and Turkey were relatively successful in. We convinced those countries to kind of stick with us, and the Marshall Plan does help to rebuild Europe and kind of makes the Europeans supportive of the United States for the most part. In Germany, we had agreed to divide Germany into 4 zones: British, French, American, and Soviet zone. Eventually, it basically becomes 2 zones: the Western zone, where the British, French, and we reside, and the Eastern zone that is controlled by the Soviet Union. So Germany gets divided into 2 countries, and you can see on the map that their capital city of Berlin is also divided into 2 sections, where there is East and West Berlin. This obviously causes problems because we will have to basically cross over enemy territory to get to West Berlin. So the Soviet Union is noticing that we're getting several wins in the early Cold War, and Joseph Stalin decides that he wants to cut off Western Berlin from West Germany. So he cuts all rail, canal, roads, so that they could kind of starve it into submission and get West Berlin either to join with East Berlin or to at least fall under the communist umbrella. Eventually, we start lifting via airplanes supplies to West Berlin, since the roads are cut off. Now, we are flying over enemy airspace, and they could have decided to shoot down these planes, but these planes are only filled with supplies. So again, for public relations in the rest of the world, the Soviet Union would look terrible if they were shooting down planes that had supplies for hungry, sick people in them. So again, we kind of win this battle about Berlin. So you're seeing a lot of wins for the Americans early on in the Cold War. However, the tide turns in 1949. It's a very important year in American history because the Soviet Union develops its first nuclear weapon, and now we can't use our nuclear monopoly, where we were the only country with nuclear weapons, against them. They now have nuclear weapons, so we have to tread a little bit more lightly because obviously it could lead to nuclear war between the 2 nuclear superpowers. So in order to continue to solidify some of our alliances, we create NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to show that we have allies across North America and Europe to try to help us along. And you have to apply to be a member of NATO, and you see Greece and Turkey are added later. West Germany and Spain are also added later, and that number has grown. So countries wanted to join NATO. In reaction to that, the Soviet Union forms the Warsaw Pact, and you can notice it's a smaller number of nations, and also these nations are forced to be part of the Warsaw Pact because they all fall under that Iron Curtain. And the Iron Curtain is going to start to expand, but kind of at the end of the 1940s, we kind of leave Europe behind because issues pop up elsewhere. So in 1949, Chairman Mao, the leader of the communists in China, there's a civil war in China, and eventually China falls to communism. So a major power in Asia is now under the umbrella of communism, and it's kind of right a next-door neighbor to the Soviet Union. So as Truman is focusing on Europe, events in Asia make it seem like he is not as focused on communism as he should be, and domestically at home, the Republican Party starts to push that maybe the Democrats were letting the communists win, that maybe the Democrats are weak on communism, and that becomes a very important theme for the rest of American history up until today, where on national security fronts, Republicans are often seen as the stronger party as compared to Democrats. So Truman knows that if there's any other issues in Asia, he has to step up to make sure that another China does not occur. And that next issue is going to be the Korean War. So North Korea does border China, and this is this domino theory where if you let one country fall to communism, several others will. So it's called a police action because we never declare this war. We go to war to try to stop the spread of communism into South Korea, and North Korea is controlled or supported by the Soviet Union. So Kim Il-sung is the leader of the communists in the North, and a dictator named Syngman Rhee is who we put into place in South Korea. So you notice it's not necessarily that they're democratic, but they are not communist, and we're okay with that. So the war begins because the Soviet Union backs North Korean troops who invade South Korea in June of 1950, and we start to see the Cold War turn hot, where now we will actually fight. We won't be in distinct combat with the Soviet Union, but the Americans will go to South Korea's aid. So you can see through these maps that at the beginning of the war in June of 1950, they're divided along the 38th parallel. Eventually, North Korea pushes South Korea pretty far down where they are on the verge of being conquered, and then you can see not too much later, we are able to intervene and push almost to the border with China and USSR. Truman decides not to go all the way because obviously that would be an issue if bombs or if bullets flew into China or the USSR. It might be extended into a larger war. And the last map on the right shows that that is how North and South Korea are divided today. So it is not necessarily a war where one side really wins or loses. It's kind of becomes a stalemate because of Truman's use of the UN. So again, Joseph Stalin agrees to the North Korean attack and says that they would only give supplies. There are Soviet Union troops who fight, but they're kind of done secretly, so even if they are killed by the Americans, Stalin would have to admit to them being there in the first place to go after us, and he doesn't do that. So the United States would fight North Korean aggression pretty heavily because of their loss of China. And it was only to deter aggression, though. It's called a police action by the United Nations, although really the Americans are leading this. And they are not going to let the communists spread, but they also cannot conquer North Korea and make it one Korea because it is only a police action. So some of the side effects of this war is that we get a significantly larger number of troops in Europe and in Asia on the American side, but also NATO forces. We show that we're going to be very committed to stopping the spread of communism, and also that we, as Americans, are getting more deeply involved in an area called Indochina, which includes Vietnam, which is going to be a larger issue in our next unit in the 1960s. As the war ends, it kind of ends in a truce, and the only thing that's ever signed is a truce in July of 1953. There is never a peace treaty signed, so officially the Korean War never ends. 33,000 Americans will lose their lives, with over 100,000 being wounded or missing. South Koreans lose 1 million, and North Koreans and Chinese lose about 1.5 million. But it shows that when we need to, we will step up and fight the spread of communism, but not directly with the Soviet Union. And this will conclude the first lecture on the early Cold War in the United States. So please email me if you have any questions.